I just want to welcome all of you. My name is Kate Pagani and I work at CARLA, and we're just so delighted to have so many people here today and lots of unfamiliar names. So we're happy that we've got an audience that's coming from outside of the University of Minnesota as well as inside the University of Minnesota. I also want to just take a moment to thank the co-sponsors of today's presentation, the CLA Career Readiness Initiative and the Department of Spanish and Portuguese Studies. So without further delay, I'm delighted to introduce Sara Mack, who is in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese Studies here at the University of Minnesota, and who is a CLA Career Readiness faculty consultant. I might be getting that wrong. Sara can correct me. And the title of her paper today is Global Perspectives of Working Careers, a Critical Approach to Career Readiness in Second Language Classrooms. So I'll hand it over to Sara.
Thank you, Kate, and thanks to CARLA for inviting me to spend this time with everyone today. Before we start, I want to say a special thank you to those of you who are doing your full-time jobs today and also doing a second full-time job caring for someone at home right now. So special shout out to all the caregivers here today. You're not alone, the struggle is real, and thank you for coming even though it was probably hard with your 2 full-time jobs you're already doing. I also want to say a special thank you to K-12 educators joining us today, or if you're viewing this recording after the live presentation. A lot of you are probably teaching classes right now, and I just want to give a special shout out to you for all the work that you're doing, especially now to help our K-12 learners to keep their educational progress going during these times. So the title of the talk that I'm giving today is the same as one I had planned to give last April. So Global Perspectives of Working Careers, a Critical Approach to Career Readiness in Second Language Classrooms. When I was first scheduled to give this talk in spring, I mean, for one thing, it was lucky that I had already prepared this because I am one of the people doing the 2 full-time jobs right now with grade school at home and also teaching college. So I was able to revisit the slides that I had prepared, but something I kept coming back to was, how do we put into words what has changed since this talk was originally scheduled, since we would have come together at that time. And I think, maybe everything has changed and in a way nothing has changed. But one of the things that I think many of us are motivated by right now is the opportunity to re-envision and challenge the role that higher education assumes in our society. And a few weeks ago, I had the privilege to attend a webinar featuring Tressie McMillan-Cotton on race and purpose in higher education. And she put it in this way: this is the moment for higher education, not institutions, higher education as a field, to figure out what it is we do, how we're going to do it, and to revisit our sort of moral, ethical responsibility to the faith that people have placed in us. This is the beginning of a renegotiation of us earning and deserving the public's faith in us. So that's kind of the big picture point that I wanted to offer as a point of departure today for us all. So where we'll start is with the broad context. As many of you are likely aware, in the US there are increasing efforts in higher educational institutions to make students something called career ready. And quite often that readiness includes the idea that we prepare students to operate in global, international, and intercultural contexts. And again, a side note here for the K-12 teachers, if you're in the K-12 field, your institution is likely a bit ahead of where we are in higher education. And you also might be more used to the term college and career readiness, or CCR. So I want to acknowledge that this is something that has been of critical interest in increasing pressure in the K-12 schools, I think, for a little bit longer than it has for higher education. So for those of us who are, or those of us who are here today who are new to the topic, there are varying definitions across organizations and institutions of what career readiness entails. For example, NACE, which is the National Association of Colleges and Employers, so this is the organization whose purpose it is to link higher education and employers, has around 15,000 members in the United States. NACE defines career readiness as the attainment and demonstration of requisite competencies that broadly prepare college graduates for a successful transition into the workplace. And I'd like everybody to note here the use of the word attainment and demonstration, along with competency and transition into the workforce, and because we'll be coming back to that a little bit later on in the talk. So my institution, the University of Minnesota, and specifically the College of Liberal Arts, has a little bit different definition. So it's similar elements, but phrased in a different way. It starts by talking about core career competencies and how they tie into the liberal arts. But it also notes the uncertain and dynamic economy, which is, of course, more relevant and apt now than ever. It talks about the importance of our students being able to articulate the competencies and also how to translate that language of employers across cultures. So not just the culture of the employers, but others as well. So those are some examples of definitions. And I think that at this point, almost every institution does have some type of career readiness program, whether they're highly structured or not. So as we look at these models across institutions, one thing that is a shared characteristic is that they're often built on a set of competencies, although they're presented in different ways. So here we have Clarion University, which is on the left of your screen. College of Coastal Georgia is on the right. And in the center is my institution, the University of Minnesota. This is what we fondly call the wheel. And as you can see here, the graphic design underscores the interrelated nature and the cyclical development of competencies. And for those of you who can't read the words on the screen of the wheel, the competencies that have been defined here at the University of Minnesota in the College of Liberal Arts are, starting at the top, analytical and critical thinking, applied problem solving, ethical reasoning and decision making, innovation and creativity, digital literacy, career management, engaging diversity, active citizenship and community engagement, teamwork and leadership, and oral and written communication. Another element that's shared across many models at different institutions is something that includes metacognitive reflection. So in other words, teaching students to take the lead in assessing their own career readiness and their own competencies. And there are lots of ways that this can happen. It can be simple worksheets to oral activities in class, or to a fully automated computer-guided self-reflection. And that's something that we do have at my institution. It's called RATE, which stands for Reflect, Articulate, Translate, and Evaluate. And this tool in particular offers lots of options for both faculty and students to use it to support metacognitive reflection about the learning experience. So at this point, usually a question that comes up is why? Why career readiness? Why are we doing this? And I think it's good to unpack it a bit, not just at the beginning of the conversation, but to keep coming back to it. In the work that I've been doing with this over the past few years, what I've seen is that on an individual level, most people have different reasons for doing it. But for many, and the reason that is a driving force behind what I'm presenting today, it's truly because systematizing career readiness is a necessary part of the work that needs to be done to advance equity, to get all of our students in the position to make choices about what they want their life to be like, to increase access, to be more inclusive, and also as a way to resist and break the cycle of income inequality that we see in our society. So we're going to have just one moment of reflection. And we're doing, I've structured this so that it's friendly to the introverts. We're not actually going to report this verbally or in the chat. So it really is a moment of, I guess, self-reflection to think about. Do you currently have a career readiness program or initiative at your institution? That's maybe not so reflective as much as a yes or no. But then who is responsible for this work? If you have that, who actually gets the work of that done? Who's charged with making it happen? How does it fit into the curriculum, if it's integrated into the curriculum at all? And finally, and this is hearkening back to the previous slide, why would you Or why do you engage with career readiness right now? So we're just going to take a couple seconds for people to reflect on that on your own. Okay, so a big question that comes for me as a faculty member is, how does this tie into existing curriculum or to what I'm doing in my classroom or what's happening in the discipline? And the first thing that I always stress when I give talks like this is that career readiness should align with what we're already doing. And it shouldn't add something that's not connected to our learning objectives. So some of the ways that this can happen that doesn't require redesign of a course can be things like syllabi and course management site language. So if you have career readiness support or resources on your campus, you can integrate those into your course management site. You can put links to them in your syllabi. So really simple things like that is a way that you can integrate some of these things. At the University of Minnesota, we have that tool I mentioned called RATE. So if you are a University of Minnesota community member, you can assign RATE as a tool as homework in your class, and that will give your students a chance to reflect on a course experience or an assignment. And then what I'm going to focus on today is what I believe we have as a unique opportunity in the languages. And that is, especially in beginning and intermediate courses that are part of the general education sequence, we can often do meta work with career readiness via our existing curriculum. So I hope that already people are saying, but wait a second, there's some key issues here that would need to be resolved before we actually take the step of integrating any of these things. Some of those key issues are what I'm going to talk about next. So one issue, and I'm going to play, this is a little bit of in the category of Captain of the Obvious. And this is a broad issue. This is an umbrella issue. Career readiness programs and initiatives exist in a society that is inequitable and within institutions that have often inadvertently helped to maintain cycles of inequality. And I want to go back to one thing that has changed since I was first scheduled to give this talk in April. And I think that I was going to make the same argument in April, but I feel like my work on this slide is a lot easier now because more people are aware of this. And I think I want to acknowledge that, this is thanks to organizations like Black Lives Matter. It's thanks to the protesters. So this went from being a sequence of many slides to one to something that is really a lot easier to summarize compared to how it would have been approached in April. But just to point to a couple of resources, especially when we talk about the idea of a cycle of inequality. One resource that you already have a graphic for up here is from the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis. They have a report that was written, I believe, first in 2014, but then modified in 2020 on college tuition and its very complicated dance with income inequality. So that's a source I'd recommend if you want to learn more about cycles of inequality. The other resource is example, another report that came out several years ago. If you're not familiar with this report, I highly recommend it. It's called Engines of Inequality, and it's an indictment of sorts as it details how institutions, specifically higher education institutions, don't just fail to help break the cycle of inequity and inequality. There are actually ways in which they help to drive it. So those are two examples from the outside world, outside of language teaching and learning, when we talk about cycles of inequality and how higher ed is working to break those or unfortunately in some ways to promote them. That's what we're talking about. So we also have the whole notion about student identity, right? So when we're talking about different aspects of student identity, career readiness is also inequitable in a way because how students are able to approach it to a certain extent depends on their identity, their own class background, the kinds of attitudes towards jobs and careers that they get from their home environment. But this, I think, is something that language teaching and learning has actually been kind of talking about and approaching from different angles in previous years already. So one quote that I wanted to share was from the MLA profession work done in 2019, and in which they noted specifically, we need to ensure that our small language communities, so that is the communities, small language communities of where we're teaching, are at least as diverse as our institutions, and that students from all financial backgrounds feel empowered to take our classes. And one way we can do that through a program like Career Readiness is to help students understand how the skills that they are and the knowledge that they're acquiring in our classes will translate into success, and I put success in quotes, however our students choose to define success, so that they don't need to be making a choice between what they see as a very high paying career in that's on more of a tracked program. There's room in their education and their professional formation for something like a language class that can fit into their goals, no matter what their goals are. Another quote that I wanted to share is from an article. This was actually from an article about international teachers and learners, but I think it fits really well here. And again, for those of you who can't in a place where you can read on the screen, neoliberal global competition implies that there will inevitably be a winner and a loser. Yet the players in the competition are not on an equal playing field in the first place. Rather, they are positioned hierarchically in the economic, political, racial, cultural, and linguistic relations of power in the globalized world, which create traps of recolonization. So all this to say, some of the issues that we will need to deal with in career readiness are very complicated, multi-layered, multi-dimensional, but we have a lot to draw on, especially in the field of language teaching, to be able to help us to untangle some of these things. Another way to summarize it is to think about what I call kind of language teaching and learning's interrelated slippery slopes. So these are not really things specific to career readiness. These are things that have been identified as issues, for example, in conversations about internationalizing the curriculum. So things like rationalization and technologization of discourse. A dynamic that situates language as something understood from the monoculture of the students rather than the foreign cultures they are supposedly learning. So you can imagine if you're talking about looking at a competency, right? Competencies and what it means to be competent in, for example, as a leader, that's going to vary across cultures. And so we need to make sure that we're not just presenting a monoculture view of what is good leadership. Another one, language viewed narrowly as a tool to accomplish tasks, right? And I think where this comes into play is, a language to support a global capitalist society, right? How do we make sure that we're aware of the dynamics that are coming together when we bring this kind of language about career readiness into the classroom. And then finally, operating in English-dominated spaces. So there's been increasing attention to the issues with the homogenization of academic culture, where English-based culture and US-dominated ideas are the ones that can all too easily become the focus of our classrooms, both here in the United States and abroad. So another good summary that I wanted to share before I move on to some ways to deal with this is from Kubota in 2014. Foreign language professionals are confronted with the question of whether they can afford to simply promote the translingual and transcultural competence of domestic students without taking into consideration the political and economic power dynamics in the globalized world that are transforming cultural, linguistic, and academic practices. It is necessary for the foreign language professional community to ask whether it should only contribute to fulfilling institutional and national interests and accumulating economic and symbolic capital, or whether it should take on responsibility for creating a more morally attuned global and local or glocal society by removing barriers to economic, racial, ethnic, cultural, and linguistic that should say inequalities. I'm sorry about that. So what I'd like to propose here is that career readiness is a way to approach some of these issues, but we also need to be aware that it's operating within this larger society, within these larger pressures that we have in the field of language teaching and learning. We've already identified to a large extent and have been dealing with in the discipline for some years now. So how do we go about addressing some of these issues? How do we get our brain around all of these various things that are floating around here? The definition from NACE that I showed earlier used the words attainment, transition to the workplace, and competency. So I think at a very basic level, there are some tweaks in order when we talk about definitions. So for example, we can make more visible the changing nature of the competencies. I think there's not perfect attainment of any career competency. There's a continuum. There isn't a transition necessarily to a workplace as the end goal. There's a dynamic and multi-dimensional ongoing process. We have students who might transition to the workplace several times during their career or during their adult life. And finally, the idea of competency itself is problematic in different ways. And one way that we could approach that is to explore a little bit more the idea of cultural humility. And because the idea of competency, the idea of what's important as a professional is so dependent on the context, and it's also dependent on the culture. So the idea of approaching it from a place of learning and observing rather than going straight to the idea of defining what it takes to be competent can be something that's useful in this area. So again, to explore this idea of how we can make this all work, we can help students to develop the knowledge and skills for how to navigate. Or a different way to put this is to imagine that as learners of language and culture in a pluralistic world, a goal is to develop the skill of how to figure out how to navigate that can be applied across languages, across cultures, and across disciplinary boundaries, and I will add across professional contexts. And this is something that we're used to doing. This is kind of a lot of our daily work as language teachers. So I'd like to suggest a corollary. This was a definition of career readiness that we saw a few slides ago. And then we have the definition from NACE as well. With a few tweaks, I think we can come up with a little more of a statement that can guide us a little bit more. So my suggestion for that would be career readiness includes an awareness of the dynamic and changeable nature of professional roles, responsibilities, and relationships, and the ability to seek, acquire, and apply the knowledge and skills needed to navigate them. And again, if you're a language teacher, you know that raising awareness and helping our students really develop that ability to seek, acquire, and apply new knowledge and skills is really what we are involved with in our daily work. It happens every day in our classes. So I think that we're uniquely poised to make contributions in this area. So how are people doing this? What are some examples? How can this all work? what I'm going to showcase today are some examples from the course that I coordinate. This is an intermediate level Spanish course that has about 20 sections per semester, or around 500 students total, and it's the final course in our language requirement sequence. And our textbook already included a very common topic for beginning and intermediate level textbooks, the topic of jobs and careers. So I've organized this today with a focus on text because we are transitioning to a multi-literacies informed framework for our courses. But if texts aren't your thing, there's obviously different ways to organize this. I do want to say one thing before I go ahead to the examples in this section. What you're about to see was only possible with the support of from collaboration across our college and really across the university. The acknowledgements that I'll show at the end of the talk do recognize specific people and organizations that helped with this. But I want to be clear before we even see the examples that this has been the work of many people. It hasn't been just the work of me. It took a lot of collaboration and a lot of support to get all of these things off the ground. So one text that we've integrated to support the goals related to career readiness in the course is to use a tool called Going Global. And this Going Global is a career services, I guess it's basically a subscription that our students can access through our university. And you're able to look up job postings, internship postings, things like that, basically job documents. You can do it in the target language. You can pick what country you want to focus on. So our students will be, have an opportunity to explore kind of what's available out there for jobs in certain countries. They get to do it in the target language. And it also gives them the chance to learn how to navigate a resource that they'll be able to use even after they graduate. So this is one small way where we're addressing that equity piece. You can imagine that students who are in our classes, when we ask them to imagine what their ideal profession is or what their ideal work is, what do they want to do, right? If they don't come from a background or they're not at a place where they have had exposure to that or they know what that is, they're really at a disadvantage compared to students in that same classroom who might have a lot of experience with that from their home background, from their high school experience, whatever it is. So this is an activity where we're getting a lot done. We can look at these texts and we can have our students look at how language works. So, you know, what verb forms are used. So kind of like the grammar things, what vocabulary pieces are we seeing here? But we're also helping students who are not very professional or who are not very familiar with the professional world to be able to do their own research and their own inquiry into fields and areas where they have no experience. And we're also working a little bit here at getting our brains around an aspect of diversity, which is the awareness that we have vast areas of human endeavor that span the globe. So our students are probably used to thinking about what kinds of internships could they do here on our campus or in the United States. This kind of makes the perspective there a lot broader. What kinds of internships are available here in the screenshot here, for example, in Uruguay, that they could explore. So that's one text. Another text that we use is to look at the idea of how career readiness varies internationally, interculturally, and globally by looking at text from other universities. So the first one here is it's from a Facebook page from the University of Puerto Rico. And again, there's some opportunities here, not just to explore like the available designs through the way the page is laid out, but also the photos, the way language is used in that slogan, things like that. Another example is this is a screenshot from a handout about job interviews. So these are typical questions for a job interview. This is from a university in Mexico. And again, this provides an opportunity for students to see, you know, not only question formation, how do you form questions in Spanish, but also in this cultural context, what are the questions that are important? If you don't teach Spanish, I have a classic example here from a university in France that most people will be familiar with. This is the web page from the Sorbonne for their career readiness initiative. It's kind of the portal to their career readiness site. So across languages, there are lots of resources available that could be used in tasks like this. Another way that we have texts and comparisons set up in our class is to look at career readiness images as artifacts, as things that are cultural products that reflect values and norms. The example here is from the wheel. Here, it's the same wheel as I showed you earlier, but this is the Spanish version. And we also have the Instagram account of a career readiness program at the University of San Andres in Argentina. So we can do meta work here on how language is used to create and maintain culturally embedded worldviews. And especially because these texts are produced for undergraduate learners, we can see that they incorporate the images and symbols that make them accessible to beginning language learners, but they also offer contextual complexity that would make them appropriate for more advanced students as well. Another text that I'm going to talk about briefly today is what I call Alumni and Friends class visits. So this is something that's brand new, and it's thanks to Emily Loudon and Erica Thiele in our CLA Career Services office. They may be here in the room today. If you are, Erica and Emily, thank you again for this. Just last week, they did recordings with alumni and friends of the University of Minnesota, Spanish speakers who work in the local community, either in for-profit or nonprofit contexts. And this is something that's been in the development for about 18 months. So we had a series of questions that were developed for these folks. This was piloted last semester in our in-person classes, but obviously because of COVID-19, we had to switch it all to virtually this year. So we do have time to take a look at how this all, how this interface looks for our students. One of the student worker in career services was the interviewer for these little mini events for each of the speakers. And so as our students get to know these people, they're introduced to them by a peer, who is Emily, and we're just going to listen to her introduction right now. Oops.
Wonderful. Hi everyone, my name is Emily. I use she, hers pronouns, and I'm a third-year student majoring in political science and Spanish studies. Today I'm speaking with Lupe, and we're going to be having a career conversation. So I'm going to be asking her a few questions in English, and she's going to be responding in Spanish. So right off the bat, Lupe, if you just want to give a quick introduction, your background, history, your career path, interests, majors, experience, all of that stuff.
Claro que sí.
Okay, so the interview goes on, and so each person gives their own background and history, and that is that gives us an opportunity, again, at the intermediate level, we're looking at, in our course at least, we look at the use of the past tense, right? So in that first question, we have an opportunity for our students to explore how language is used and the diverse ways which these 5 speakers communicate about their own history. And we can look in detail then about how language, they're able to communicate that through the language, but we can also see how they are different in how they do that. Another question that, the next question in the interview sequence is what competencies have played the biggest role in their career journey so far. So again, this is a very meta conversation that they're having here, and our students have already learned about the competencies, so they're able to attach what their previous knowledge to make meaning from that. We also talk about diversity. So in our class, we've been discussing different aspects of diversity. From your perspective, what do you wish recent college grads knew about the role diversity plays in the workplace? What knowledge or skills do you wish students would have in this area? And again, what we see in the interviews is a real diversity of opinions on this. So we're presenting the idea of diversity as a competency, but we're already underscoring the idea that it depends on what your definition, what's important about that will vary depending on who you're talking to. And then the final one, which is very long, but I will go ahead and read it for people who can't read it on their own screens. Our College of Liberal Arts language requirement prepares students with a strong base of Spanish language skills and awareness of Spanish-speaking cultures, and students can gain more advanced knowledge through the major and minor. In terms of articulating that experience, what is your advice for students in this class who are fulfilling the requirement but not majoring or minoring? In other words, for students who have language skills and intercultural knowledge, but are not necessarily at the advanced level, what's the best way to explain to an employer how this can still be an asset in an organization, a business, or a work team? So here again, this is a very meta kind of conversation, and we are really getting at that idea of, for intermediate learners who may not be going on to study, how can they understand that what we're doing in the course can still be of value to them, and how can they begin to be able to articulate that as well? In my course, we have alignment with other course elements as well. One of the things that we do is a metacognitive reflection called the Basic Outcomes Student Self-Assessment, or BASA, which probably many of the attendees here today are familiar with. But some of the metacognitive reflection we do really aligns with that, is parallel to what we do with that. And then there are also typical intermediate activities, which we do in some semesters, but not every semester, but things like mock job interviews. So if you want to look at question formation, there's a lot of potential for alignment there, or things like narrating previous job experiences. And that, again, for the intermediate task that we often have of working on the ability to narrate in the past tense, that's a natural fit. And then at the end of the sequence here, and with the example I'm showing you from my course, we kind of bring it all together and close the loop with a metacognitive reflection, which in our case here at the University of Minnesota, we can do with the RATE tool that's provided by our college. So, best practices. Best practices, I think, it's hard to propose best practices at this point because, at least in higher education, this is such a new endeavor. And in fact, if you go to that NACE website, the National Association of Colleges and Employers, there is a best practices button. You click on it, and it's a blank document. So I just want to underscore, right, when we talk about best practices, I think in any field that is this new, we have to acknowledge that we need to be continually assessing especially during this early period, what are best practices. But I think some very easy things are, number one, align with what you're already doing, what is already working for you. Reinventing the wheel here is not something that anyone has time for, nor is it necessary. Another thing, and this has been absolutely instrumental for me, is get outside support and perspective and seek partnerships outside your home department. CLA Career Services, in my case, has been a huge, not only a source of support, but also a source of different perspectives that have really informed how I've been approaching this. Also, keep disciplinary goals at the center. In our discipline, our goals are ones that really can align with what, especially the equity goals of career readiness. And so I don't feel like we need to make big changes with that. We just need to do a better job of linking the goals that we already have, those objectives that we're also committed to already, with what's going on with career readiness as it's developing. And then, of course, check your priors, right? Who are your students? What motivates them? if you haven't done like recent student surveys about, you know, what they are looking for in terms of their experiences, in terms of their careers, what they want out of the class, that's something that really has been very, very helpful for me as I've done this process, is making sure to keep going back to the students to see what it is that they see as their own needs. Areas for continued work and discussion. Of course, this is always a big, we could have you know, 3 or 4 slides on this, but I think the key things are, how can we problematize competencies, especially in language teaching and learning, so that they align with our disciplinary goals and objectives. Within institutions, if you're not a language teacher, maybe this is something that's relevant to everyone. Whose work is this and how is it supported? And also there's the kind of the persistent barriers to inclusivity and access that we see in so many different areas of our institutions. They're operational here as well. And then finally, what I feel is the biggest challenge is advocacy for language learning, to be able to make sure that we get support for doing things like this. Like I said, the model or the examples I showcased here were only possible because of institutional support and partnerships, and that it doesn't happen systematically without that kind of support. And so that brings us back to the big picture that where I'd like to conclude today. And this is some text from Lydia Tang's work entitled Against Smallness, that some of you may be familiar with. And she says, language programs that drive innovation tend to see themselves as part of a broader humanities ecosystem and are intrigued by the big questions. What does the future of work look like? What skills will our students need? How will the university of the future be organized? Will institutions retain departments and majors? And if not, what will take their places? This broader perspective enables faculty members in language, literatures, and cultures to think outside the box, contribute to reimagining the humanities for our current age, and position themselves for leadership positions on their campuses and beyond. So I really feel that in the languages, we do have a very important role to play, especially right now in so many ways. And I hope that the presentation today has provided some food for thought on why and how we need to critically examine career readiness as it becomes integrated into language learning, and also how our work in this area can be a part of our leadership role in our institutions. Before we switch to the Q&A, I'd like to end with one last slide, and this is an important one that recognizes the collaborative nature of this work. If you have resources of your own that you'd like to pass along, Marlene is going to put a link in the chat right now to a document where you can clip, if you want to clip URLs or articles or your own stories in that document. That will be showing up in the chat in a second. So with that, I would like to thank everyone for coming today, and I hope that everyone stays safe, stays happy, and we'll now turn it over to the Q&A.
Thanks, Sarah. So I just want to repeat to everybody that we're going to open the chat up. So you're welcome to put your questions in the chat. If you prefer to ask a question using your voice instead of your fingers, then you can use the raise hand feature in the participant window. So you just click on participants at the bottom of the screen and you should see a place where you can raise your hand. Sarah, while we're waiting for questions to come in, I have one question to kind of kick things off. I'm wondering how you managed teacher professional development in the course that you're coordinating. So to get teacher buy-in, to get them prepared to implement these career readiness materials that you had integrated into 1004. You're muted.
Thank you. So I think that is a big piece that I didn't touch on at all today. And I think when especially in the discussion of support and how institutions can support that, it's vital. And one of the challenges I think is that to do it systematically, you have to also have a systematic plan for support. And so where we are in our, I would say in the rollout right now, is that we have begun the process of professional development during the spring. And our attention and our efforts now have been, over the summer, we're, by necessity, we're dedicated to the other tasks that we needed to do for our online switch. So I would say, in terms of training, we were able to leverage the resources we had, like for example, with the rate tool. Some of the training that we did for that is actually provided by the College of Liberal Arts. So the idea of, if you're doing work like this, identifying what places on campus are already doing the kinds of training that your instructors and you yourself may need, I think is a key thing. And I would say the other thing that's been, or that was helpful back when we were meeting in person, is to be able to talk about these things face to face in our meetings and really discuss the ways, or the idea of what our students needed. So that I think was happening a lot more organically when we were still meeting face to face, and it's been a lot more challenging now in the online only environment. So I would say that it's an ongoing challenge, but I think that in a way it makes sense that we all kind of enter into that together, right? This is because there's so many aspects of this that are still developing, and especially once we build in the equity piece, those discussions are also, they're happening outside of career readiness as well. So you kind of have this, different layers of professional development that you need to address to make it successful. And I would say in our case, we're still working on bringing all those building blocks together.
Other questions? So again, feel free to type questions in the chat or to raise your hand in the participant window. So I can ask another question, Sarah.
I have a question for the group too, but.
Can you tell us a little bit about, and maybe I missed it if you did talk about it, about how long it took you to develop the materials and sort of integrate them into your curriculum? And did you have to make changes to your existing curriculum for that particular unit? Did you have to eliminate content from your textbook? And what was the process for that?
Mm-hmm. So in terms of when I started with this work, I believe in around 2017, so close to 3 years, I've been kind of engaging in cohorts and on-campus experiences and things like that, and learning about career readiness, and thinking about ways that we can integrate it into the course. And in terms of the actually redesigning the chapter itself, our case was a little bit different than I think some people might experience, because we also, at the same time as we were thinking about career readiness, we were also redesigning for an internationalized curriculum. So we had a lot of different elements going on with that. And what we did end up doing was cut content from a different chapter of the textbook, so we could make space on our syllabus for a deeper engagement in that chapter on jobs and careers. So a deeper engagement and actually looking at texts that were richer than the ones our textbook provided. That it just always takes more time. And in the back when we were in our in-person classes, that was something that was I think it was a little bit more easier to gauge, like how much more time the students needed to interact, how much time we as instructors needed to in the class period to be able to get our students where they needed to be. So I would say that that's a challenge that I think we're going to be facing now, is to assess what we're doing in the online only environment to make sure the same things are happening. And that process we're now beginning. Basically, we're kind of at the same place where we were in our in-person classes, 2 years ago with that.
Sarah, we have a question in the chat from Hong Lee. What suggestions do you have for integrating a unit on career readiness in an advanced language course?
I think that is something that we've wrestled with a little bit in some of the cohort experiences that we've done here on campus at the University of Minnesota. And one of the, I guess the first question is always, and again, it's a little bit different, I think, in the US context, where we don't tend to have our advanced courses in a language tend to be on a specific topic area. So the colleagues with whom I've worked who teach advanced level courses tend to have, like for example, they're teaching modern Latin American literature. One example from a colleague that I could share is, for example, there was a project on identifying how, and I'm not a literature person, so I'm going to get some of the terminology wrong, but the idea of voice and authorship and authenticity, right? It was a general assignment that this person had. And looking at this, so the students were already analyzing and comparing the different ways that happened through the literature. So they still did the same assignment, but as part of that assignment, they also did a meta conversation about what kind of takeaways could they make about the idea of diversity and voice and like the definition of racial diversity in general. And then at the end, they articulated basically, in this course and through that assignment, I have a better understanding of diversity because of, and then they would cite X, Y, and Z, the activity or the different voices and the different lessons and that they had learned from those assignments. So I think that doing that kind of metacognitive reflection on assignments tends to be the most common way of approaching it in advanced language courses.
Sarah, I've got another question from Adriana, who wants to know if you see other places or chapters where career readiness can be integrated for 1004.
Oh, okay. So that's, and 1004 is 1004. So that's the course that I coordinate, and for where the examples that I showed today, they were taken from that course. At this point, I feel like our slate is full with what we have. I think in general, like the general intermediate topics that lend themselves well in this area are a general topic of identity and we do so much work in helping students understand how to talk about their own experience and their own identity and communicating who they are. And I think that would be, feel like that's kind of the next area that makes sense to move into in that particular course as we talk about issues of how to communicate identity. I think that would be a place where we can build that in. So I'm just reading the chat here too. So I can see the chat now here too, Marlene. So Lauren says, oh, sorry, that's not a question. Any other questions?
Yeah, we have time for maybe one more question if anybody has something else to add.
My question for the group was going to be how to, almost every place has the oral and written communication competency as one of, right, it's one of the key competencies. It's a key goal and objective. And I think it's going to be good for all of us to think about how does that competency change when most of our communication is taking place on Zoom now. At least most of our oral communication is taking place on Zoom. That competency is going to have to be revisited.
So Gabriella just put a question in the chat, Sarah, wanting to know students' response to the inclusion of career readiness.
So we have a little bit of data on that from, we did a survey in just 2 sections last year, and overall for our students in Spanish, the response has been very positive because we have a lot of students who are doing the CLA language requirement, but not necessarily going on to major or minor. And many of them feel like it's a place where they're acknowledged, like the work that they're doing in the class is acknowledged as being valid in a way that they haven't seen before. So even though they're not majoring or minoring, they appreciate that the role of the class and kind of how they're in that class as a learner is still valid, right? Because we're coming out and saying, even if you're not going to major and minor, this can be valuable to you. That kind of mirrors back, right? It goes back and forth for them to be able to say, I'm not majoring in minor, I'm minoring, I'm still important in this class. So I think that has been one of the most lovely aspects of it. There is a funny story about even students who don't enjoy it. We had one student wrote on a course final assessment. I really didn't enjoy that chapter at all, but it was really helpful anyway. So I think, and I love that kind of reply because it means that they're thinking critically about this, right? Like maybe they didn't enjoy it, but they can still take a step back and see how it might be helpful down the road. So I would say overall it's been positive, and even the things that the very important critiques that we've received, we've been seeing an element of kind of a grudging gratefulness of that we were including this at all.
Well, that was a perfectly timed response because it is now exactly 1 o'clock. So we want to thank Sara for her presentation and for engaging us in a really interesting way of looking at career readiness through the lens of equity. I think these are questions that a lot of us are thinking about right now. So it's a great way to start off the CARLA speaker series. We want to thank all of you for coming today, taking time out of your busy day to be here, and you're taking more time on Zoom when we know that you are spending a lot of time on Zoom. So we really appreciate that. And we hope that we'll see you all on October 8th for our next talk. Have a wonderful rest of the day, and we'll see you all soon. Take good care.